What if I told you that a single tear from a child could topple an empire of lies and spark a revolution of the heart? In the next few minutes, you'll witness a tale so powerful, so emotionally charged, that it defies everything you thought you knew about human nature. Meet Jack Harrison, a man who had it all: power, prestige, the adoration of millions. But beneath the polished smile lurked a soul corroded by ambition and deceit. Prepare yourself. The story you're about to hear will shake you to your core. Jack Harrison awoke in his luxurious apartment overlooking the Potomac River. At 45, he was the rising star of American politics, known for his magnetic charisma and apparent devotion to social causes. As he prepared for another day of campaigning, Jack reflected on his journey to this point. Born into a middle-class family in a small Midwest town, Jack had always dreamed of power. From a young age, he learned to manipulate situations to his advantage, using his natural charm and an almost supernatural ability to say exactly what people wanted to hear. His political career began early, as a city council member in his hometown, where he quickly stood out for his passionate rhetoric in defense of the less fortunate. But behind the captivating smile and fiery speeches, Jack hid a dark truth. His dedication to social causes was a carefully constructed facade. For him, the poverty and suffering of others were not problems to be solved, but opportunities to be exploited. The more problems I appear to fight, the more popular I become, Jack thought, adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. And the more popular I am, the more power I have. That morning, Jack had a scheduled visit to an underprivileged community in the outskirts of Detroit. It was another stop on his national tour, part of his strategy to position himself as a strong candidate for higher office in the upcoming elections. As his driver took him to the airport, Jack mentally reviewed the visit's script. His team had already prepared everything: the families he would meet, the strategically positioned cameras, the emotional speeches he would make. It was all a meticulously planned staging to reinforce his image as the people's savior. On the flight to Detroit, Jack found himself looking out the window, observing the vast American territory stretching below him. For a brief moment, he felt a pang of what could be guilt. He remembered his father, an honest man who had always taught him about the importance of integrity. "Sorry, Dad," he muttered to himself. "But this is the only way to really change things." He quickly pushed those thoughts away. There was no room for doubt or remorse in his rise to power. Jack knew he was about to take another crucial step towards his ultimate goal. Today's visit would be broadcast live to the entire country, and he was determined to make the best possible use of this stage. Upon landing in Detroit, Jack was greeted by a small crowd of supporters and journalists. With his characteristic smile, he waved to the cameras and made some statements about the importance of combating social inequality. "Today, we're going to see up close the reality of millions of Americans," he said, his voice laden with an emotion that sounded genuine even to his closest advisors. "And I promise you, I won't rest until every citizen of this country has a dignified life." As he was led to the car that would take him to the community, Jack didn't realize he was about to face a challenge that would test not only his political skill but also the limits of his own conscience. Jack's convoy wound through the narrow, pothole-ridden streets of Hope Valley, one of the poorest communities on the outskirts of Detroit. The unfinished brick houses and makeshift shacks contrasted drastically with the luxurious armored SUV in which the politician traveled. Inside the vehicle, Sarah, his press secretary, was giving the final recommendations. "Remember, Jack, the Johnson family has been instructed on how to act. Mrs. Johnson will talk about the difficulties of raising 3 children alone, and Mr. Johnson will mention the lack of medical care in the area. Everything is prepared for you to offer solutions and appear genuinely moved." Jack nodded, his face a mask of concentration. "And the child? We have a child, right? That always works well on camera." Sarah consulted her notes. "Yes, little Timmy, 7 years old. He's been instructed to hug you when you approach. It'll be the perfect moment for photos." The car stopped in front of a simple house, but visibly better maintained than the others around it. This was where Jack's surprise visit would take place. Cameras from various networks were already positioned, ready to capture every moment of the politician's encounter with the randomly chosen family. Jack got out of the car, immediately adopting an expression of compassionate concern. He walked towards the house, surrounded by security guards and advisors, while greeting the people who crowded to see him. "Good afternoon, my friends," he exclaimed, his voice projected so everyone could hear. "I'm here to see your reality up close and to tell you that you're not alone in this struggle." The door of the house opened, and Mrs. Johnson appeared, followed by her 3 children. She seemed nervous but managed to force a smile when Jack approached. "Mrs. Johnson," said Jack, taking the woman's hands in his, "tell me about your life here. What are the biggest challenges you and your family face?" Mrs. Johnson began to speak, her voice trembling at first but gaining confidence as she recited the text she had memorized. She spoke about unemployment, the lack of childcare, the violence in the community. Jack listened attentively, nodding with a grave expression. As the conversation continued, Timmy, Mrs. Johnson's youngest son, timidly approached Jack. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Jack crouched down, opening his arms to the child, his face lit up by a smile that seemed genuinely warm. But something unexpected happened. Instead of running for the rehearsed hug, Timmy stopped, staring fixedly at Jack. His eyes, large and dark, seemed to penetrate the politician's soul. And then, to the shock of all present, the boy began to cry. It wasn't a common child's cry, but a deep sob, laden with a sadness that seemed to come from a place far beyond his 7 years of age. Jack was momentarily paralyzed, his smile freezing into an expression of surprise and discomfort. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of that unplanned moment. Quickly recovering, Jack tried to salvage the situation. He approached Timmy, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, young man," he said, his voice soft but with a slight tremor of nervousness. "I'm here to help. You don't need to cry." But Timmy continued to sob, his small body shaking. Mrs. Johnson, clearly disturbed by the deviation from the script, tried to pull her son away, muttering apologies. Jack stood up, his face a mixture of conflicting emotions. For a brief moment, something seemed to break in his carefully constructed facade. His eyes met Timmy's again, and he saw something there that deeply shook him, a silent accusation, as if the child could see through all his lies and manipulations. Sarah quickly intervened, announcing that the visit would continue inside the house, away from the cameras. As he was led into the residence, Jack couldn't get the image of the crying boy out of his mind. That cry seemed to echo something inside him, awakening memories and emotions he had long buried. The visit proceeded as planned, with Jack making promises of improvements and leaving symbolic checks for community projects. But something had changed. The experienced politician seemed distracted, less eloquent than usual. When he finally left Hope Valley hours later, Jack was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. In the car, on the way to the hotel, he remained silent, ignoring Sarah's attempts to discuss the incident with the boy. That night, lying in his luxurious suite, Jack couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Timmy's face, those accusing eyes, that cry that seemed to carry the weight of all the empty promises and frustrated hopes he had sown throughout his career. For the first time in many years, Jack Harrison felt afraid. Not the calculated fear he used to manipulate others, but a deep, visceral fear. Fear that perhaps he had gone too far. Fear that the price of his ambition might be higher than he was willing to pay. As the night wore on, Jack didn't know that this encounter with Timmy was just the beginning of a journey that would shake the foundations of everything he had built. In the weeks following the visit to Hope Valley, Jack Harrison threw himself headlong into his campaign. Rallies, interviews, meetings with political leaders. His schedule was fuller than ever. But behind the facade of confidence and determination, Something had changed. Timmy's face, the boy who had cried in his arms, haunted Jack. He saw him in the faces of children waving at his rallies, in the looks of the poor begging for help, even in his own reflection in the mirror. At night, his dreams were tormented by visions of the boy, but now Timmy wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a silent crowd of accusing faces, all those Jack had used and discarded in his rise to power. At a particularly tumultuous rally in Philadelphia, Jack had a moment of hesitation that didn't go unnoticed by the press. In the middle of an impassioned speech about fighting poverty, he stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on a point in the crowd. For a moment, he swore he had seen Timmy there, looking at him with those same sad, accusing eyes. "Mr. Harrison? Is everything okay?" His advisor's voice brought him back to reality. Jack blinked, the vision of Timmy disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Yes, just a moment of... He hesitated, searching for the right words. Emotion. The fight against poverty can sometimes be overwhelming. The crowd applauded, interpreting his hesitation as a sign of deep compassion. But Sarah, observing closely, noticed the tremor in his hands, the sweat on his forehead. Something was wrong with Jack, and she was beginning to fear it could compromise the entire campaign. That night, alone in his hotel room, Jack faced a crisis that had been building for weeks. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, something he rarely did, and walked to the window. Outside, the lights of Philadelphia shone, reminding him of all the cities he had visited, all the promises he had made. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself, his voice breaking. "All these people trusting me." For the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to truly think about the impact of his actions. Not just the lies and manipulations, but the real consequences for the lives of the people he claimed to want to help. Social projects that never left the paper, diverted funds, entire communities left to fend for themselves after the cameras left. The weight of it all seemed to crush his chest. Jack fell to his knees, the glass of whiskey slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. Tears, long repressed, began to flow. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he didn't know exactly who he was apologizing to. To Timmy? To all the people he had deceived? To his father, whose teachings he had so completely betrayed? In that moment of vulnerability, a part of Jack wanted to confess everything, give up power, and try to fix the harm he had done. But another part, the part that had taken him so far, insisted it was too late to turn back. That the only way forward was to reach the highest power and then, perhaps, use that position to really make a difference. Jack's internal conflict was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Sarah. "Jack, is everything okay in there?" "I heard a noise." Quickly, he composed himself, wiping away the tears and forcing his voice to sound normal. "Everything's fine, Sarah. Just dropped a glass. Don't worry. Okay." She hesitated. "Remember, we have an important interview early tomorrow. You need to rest." Of course. "Good night, Sarah." When her footsteps faded away, Jack slowly got up. He looked at his reflection in the window, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. The polished facade was cracking, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it together. Little did Jack know, the real test of his resolve was yet to come. As Jack's national tour continued, the cracks in his carefully constructed image began to show. His speeches, once filled with fiery conviction, now seemed hollow and rehearsed. The charismatic smile that had won over countless voters now appeared strained and forced. At a town hall meeting in a small Ohio city, Jack faced a moment that would accelerate his unraveling. As he fielded questions from the audience, a woman stood up, her face etched with lines of hardship and disappointment. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice trembling with emotion, "4 years ago, you came to our town. You promised jobs, better schools, a community center. None of that happened. Our factory closed, our schools are falling apart, And our kids have nowhere safe to go after school. How can we believe anything you say now? The room fell silent. Jack felt the weight of every eye upon him, the accusation in the woman's words echoing the guilt that had been gnawing at him for weeks. For a moment, he considered falling back on his usual tactics: deflection, charm, empty promises. But as he opened his mouth to speak, he saw Timmy's face in his mind, those sad eyes piercing through his soul. Jack faltered, his carefully crafted persona crumbling before the audience's eyes. I'm sorry. I failed you. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Sarah, watching from the sidelines, felt her heart sink. This was not the response they had prepared for. Jack continued, his voice barely above a whisper, but picked up by the microphones for all to hear. I've made a lot of promises over the years. Too many. And I haven't kept them all. I got caught up in the game of politics, in the pursuit of power. I lost sight of what really matters: you, the people I'm supposed to serve. The audience was stunned. Some looked confused, others angry. A few nodded, a glimmer of respect in their eyes for this unexpected honesty. Before Sarah could intervene, Jack abruptly left the stage, ignoring the clamor of voices calling after him. He pushed past his security detail and burst out of the building, gulping in the cool night air. The fallout was immediate and intense. News outlets ran with headlines like "Harrison's Meltdown" and "Candidate Confesses to Empty Promises." Social media exploded with clips of Jack's confession, with commentators alternately praising his honesty and condemning his past deceptions. In the days that followed, Jack retreated from public view. He cancelled appearances, ignored calls from party leaders, and holed up in his DC apartment. Sarah and his campaign team worked frantically to contain the damage, but the narrative was spiraling out of their control. As Jack sat in his darkened living room, staring at the endless cycle of news coverage about his breakdown, he felt a strange sense of relief mixed with terror. The mask had slipped, the truth, or at least a part of it, was out. But what now? Could he salvage his career? Did he even want to? His phone buzzed incessantly with messages and missed calls. One name caught his eye: Michael Chen, an old college friend who had become a respected journalist. Michael had been trying to reach him for days. Against his better judgment, Jack picked up the phone and dialed Michael's number. "Jack, is that really you?" Michael's voice was a mixture of concern and professional curiosity. "Yeah, it's me," Jack replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Look, I know you're in a tough spot," Michael said, "but I think you owe it to the public to tell your story. The full story. No spin, no PR tricks. Just the truth. What do you say?" Jack was silent for a long moment. The truth. It was a foreign concept in the world he had inhabited for so long. But maybe, just maybe, it was his path to redemption. "Okay," he finally said. "Let's do it. But on one condition. We do this my way. No editing, no cherry-picking quotes. The whole truth, good and bad." "Agreed," Michael replied, a note of surprise in his voice. "When and where?" "Tomorrow. My place. Be ready for a long conversation." As Jack hung up the phone, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever happened next, he was done with the lies. It was time to face the consequences of his actions, to confront the man he had become. Little did he know, this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life, but shake the very foundations of the political establishment he had once so eagerly embraced. The next morning, Jack Harrison sat across from Michael Chen in his apartment study. The room, once a sanctuary of political strategizing, now felt like a confessional. Michael set up his recording equipment, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes betrayed a mix of anticipation and concern for his old friend. "Are you sure about this, Jack?" Michael asked one last time. "Once we start, there's no going back." Jack nodded, a weary determination in his eyes. I'm sure. It's time for the truth. Michael pressed record, and Jack began to speak. His voice, initially hesitant, grew stronger as he delved into his story. He spoke of his humble beginnings, his early idealism, and the gradual corruption of his values as he climbed the political ladder. I didn't start out intending to deceive anyone, Jack confessed. At first, I really believed I could make a difference. But the system, it changes you. Or maybe it just reveals who you truly are. He recounted specific instances of broken promises, of funds diverted from community projects to line the pockets of influential donors, of backroom deals that benefited corporations at the expense of the very people he claimed to champion. The visit to Hope Valley, Jack said, his voice breaking slightly. That was the turning point. There was this boy, Timmy. He saw right through me. In that moment, I saw myself through his eyes, and I was disgusted by what I had become. As the hours passed, Jack laid bare the intricate web of lies and manipulation that had defined his career. He named names, exposed corrupt practices, and revealed the dark underbelly of a political system that prioritized power over people. Michael, despite his years of journalistic experience, found himself stunned by the depth and breadth of Jack's confession. Why now? He asked. Why are you willing to risk everything by coming clean? Jack was silent for a moment, considering the question. Because the price of living with this guilt is higher than any price I'll pay for telling the truth, he finally answered. And because maybe, just maybe, by exposing the rot in the system, we can start to fix it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Jack concluded his confession. He looked utterly drained, but there was a lightness to him, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Michael stopped the recording and sat back, processing everything he had heard. Jack, this is explosive. You realize what this will do, not just to your career, but to the entire political landscape. Jack nodded. I do. And I'm prepared for the consequences. Whatever happens now, at least I can face myself in the mirror again. As Michael packed up his equipment, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, Jack, I think you did the right thing. It took courage. After Michael left, Jack stood at the window, watching the city lights come alive as darkness fell. He knew that by morning, his world would be forever changed. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not for his political future, but for his soul. The days following the release of Jack's interview were a whirlwind of chaos and controversy. As promised, Michael had released the entire unedited conversation, and its impact was seismic. News channels ran non-stop coverage, dissecting every revelation. Political allies scrambled to distance themselves from Jack, while opponents called for investigations. Social media exploded with hashtags like #HarrisonConfession and #PoliticalPurge. Jack watched it all unfold from the seclusion of his apartment, fielding calls from lawyers, former staffers, and even old friends reaching out after years of silence. Sarah had resigned, along with most of his campaign team. His party leadership had issued a statement condemning his actions and calling for his immediate withdrawal from the race. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected began to happen. Ordinary citizens, tired of political doublespeak and empty promises, started to rally behind Jack's honesty. #TruthTeller began trending, with people sharing their own stories of disillusionment with the political system. A week after the interview's release, Jack received a surprising visitor. Amanda Reeves, a grassroots community organizer he had met briefly during his visit to Hope Valley, stood at his door. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her expression a mix of wariness and respect, "I think we need to talk." Over coffee, Amanda explained that she and a group of activists saw Jack's confession as an opportunity for real change. "You've exposed the cracks in the system," she said. "Now help us fix it. Not as a politician, but as a citizen working alongside us." Jack was taken aback. Why would you want my help? After everything I've done. Amanda's gaze was steady. Because you know how the system works, the good and the bad. And because you've shown that change is possible. Your confession. That was the first step. Now take the next one. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt a spark of purpose. He agreed to meet with Amanda's group, to share his insights and help strategize for grassroots political reform. As weeks turned into months, Jack found himself in a role he never expected, that of an advisor and advocate for political transparency and accountability. He testified before congressional committees, worked with investigative journalists to expose further corruption, and spoke at colleges about the need for ethical leadership. It wasn't easy. He faced legal challenges, death threats, and the constant weight of his past actions. But with each small victory, a corrupt official exposed, a community project funded, a piece of reform legislation passed, Jack felt a piece of his old self returning. 1 year after his confession, Jack returned to Hope Valley. The community had changed. A new community center stood where an abandoned building once was, the result of grassroots efforts and proper allocation of resources. As he walked the streets, a familiar face caught his eye. Timmy, now a year older, was playing basketball with friends outside the new center. The boy spotted Jack and paused, recognition flickering in his eyes. For a moment, Jack feared seeing that same accusatory gaze that had haunted him for so long. But instead, Timmy offered a small, tentative smile and a wave before returning to his game. It was a small gesture, but to Jack, it felt like absolution. As he watched the children play, Jack realized that his journey was far from over. There was still so much work to be done, so many wrongs to right. But for the first time in years, he felt truly aligned with his purpose. He had found his redemption not in power or politics, but in the simple act of telling the truth and working to make amends. The sun was setting over Hope Valley as Jack turned to leave, casting long shadows across the street. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it, not as a politician, but as a citizen committed to real change. The silent cry that had haunted him for so long had finally been answered, not with words, but with action. As he walked away, Jack felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He had lost his political career, his power, and his prestige. But in their place, he had found something far more valuable: his integrity, and a chance to truly make a difference. Thanks for watching this gripping story of ambition, guilt, and redemption. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next emotional journey. Stay tuned for more powerful stories coming your way.